presentation will be given by Clem Peters on energy system implications of negative emission technologies. So the floor is yours, Clem.
Okay, thank you. Sorry that you have to see me present again, for those who have already seen me. So Felix was going to give this presentation, but he couldn't make it. Then Christian and Jan were going to give this presentation, but they have presentations in the other session. I'm the last man standing. Jerome is not here, so you're going to get it from me. So if it's a bit shaky, this presentation, my apologies. So the general idea of this presentation is to look at the two main alternatives for negative emissions, at least large scale, so direct air capture and bioenergy with CCS, and look at how they may link into a future energy system because they have quite different characteristics. So BECCS, most people think of it, at least, and when you look at the data initially or today, it has lower cost than direct air capture, and it produces electricity. So you can think of BECCS as a win-win, low cost plus, well, low cost relatively speaking, and it produces electricity. So that sounds like a win-win, but then direct air capture may become a game changer if you have very low cost electricity production in the future. The costs of direct air capture may be able to go down quite rapidly if you can modularize various things. So it could be that direct air capture is the winner in the future in the energy system. And this is the general idea of this paper or presentation, is exploring the different interactions that BECCS and direct air capture may have in a future energy system. And it's meant to be sort of laying out what the issues may be and not necessarily answering the questions. So first comparison, so bioenergy with CCS has been taken up most widely in integrated assessment models, particularly in the 5th assessment report cycle, and probably up till around about now. Other than afforestation, bioenergy with CCS has been dominant in the integrated assessment models. I guess one reason for that is it's pretty easy, relatively speaking, to take bioenergy and CCS and join them in a sense in the model. Whereas another aspect is biomass is a pretty versatile energy source, so it can be used in many different ways in the energy sector, not only electricity, but also biofuels, also hydrogen. Direct air capture is only really starting to emerge in integrated assessment models. There's been some calculations done previously, but more and more it's been included in models. Because of the low ambient concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, direct air capture is generally expensive. But on the other hand, it's also seen as, in some sense, environmentally benign, maybe in quotes. Certainly probably won't have the large land impacts that bioenergy and CCS might have. There will be some impacts because of the energy system that's need to drive it, water and so on, so it's not completely benign, but relative to bioenergy and CCS, maybe better. And direct air capture may be a bit more flexible in where it's sourced. You can get into discussions here on transporting biomass versus transporting CO2 and all these sorts of issues, but there could be greater flexibility with direct air capture. Hypothetically, let's say you could have nuclear power in the middle of the Australian desert, driving a direct air capture system, putting CO2 into the ground, completely separate from the energy system, the remaining energy system. So this figure here, hopefully it comes up clear enough for you guys to see. It looks at the implications in the energy system of bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture. It's coming from one model, the merge model, so don't overinterpret the results here. And it's showing the, well, at the top, I'll talk you through the figure. So at the top is electricity consumption measured in exajoules. The red is 1.5 degree scenario and the blue is a 2 degree scenario. So the first thing you will see in the merge model, at least, there's a lot more electricity consumption in the 1.5 scenario than the 2 degree scenario. And the hashed colours there, the bioenergy with CCS and the direct air capture, are the energy that's either produced from the BECCS, so it's producing about 5% of the electricity in the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario, and the direct air capture is requiring, let's say, roughly about 10% of the energy, of the electricity system. The second part of the figure there down low is the non-electric part, so basically heat. In both 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios, there's about the same amount of heat, but you can see much bigger impacts on the energy system. Bioenergy with CCS supplying about 30%, whereas direct air capture using, let's say, 30 or even 60% of the energy produced outside of the electricity sector. So BECCS and direct air capture are going to play a very dominant role in the energy system in the future. That's one important aspect. A few other interesting things there, I'm not going to talk about them, but the carbon price in the merge model at the end of the century, in 2010 prices, upwards of $1,000 a tonne, much higher, 4 times higher for 1.5 degrees. So this doesn't come for free. One thing we did in this paper, when we're putting it together, we were starting to sort of come to various conclusions, potentially, maybe a bit prematurely, on what may be the preferred option. And so we dropped back to looking at 4 different storylines of the way these energy systems may play out in the future. And I'll show the consequences of some of the storylines here. So the first one in the green there is a pro-BECCS, if you like, situation. So in that world, we have efficient BECCS plants, and we figure out ways to have very high yield improvements in agriculture, biomass more broadly. So we have a relatively, let's say, limited footprint, land footprint for the bioenergy. Maybe we're using algal options and so on, so much less competition for land and so on and so forth. And in this situation, the bioenergy with CCS might remain relatively cheap, get cheaper over time, because we've figured out how to improve yields efficiently. The sort of negative picture on bioenergy with CCS, so the land in the red, bottom left there, sort of the opposite in terms of the yields. Still high costs for land, there's logistical costs a lot to truck around biomass, competition with food, biodiversity, etc. And so biomass remains high cost. Therefore, the cost impacts of bioenergy with CCS may increase over time, making it less competitive. On the other side of the figure, we have direct air capture, a good situation and a bad situation. In the good situation, there's a lot of innovation in the direct air capture, let's say supply chain. Maybe it can be modularized, logistics made better. We have cheap electricity, solar, wind, battery storage becomes cheap. So it becomes much cheaper to run the direct air capture facility. And then the bottom right is the sort of the opposite situation, where those sorts of things don't play out, and direct air capture remains a very expensive way of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So we played around with those 4 different worlds, looked at what the costs may be of those different technologies. And I think I only just put this figure in the slides, so I'm not completely sure of what the vertical axis is. Whether I don't think it's cost. I guess that's cost per tonne. Although I'm a little bit surprised on how high it is there. Although you will see there's a range. But anyway, these are colour-coded. It's a bit hard to link to the colours, but if you take the bioenergy with CCS in the top, the green line, which is relatively flat, is the pro-bioenergy with CCS situation, so high yield improvements. The red is where things don't turn out very well on the land side. Land, biomass is expensive. Direct air capture has rapid cost declines. They could be more rapid with innovation and cheap energy. And at the end of the century, you may end up, you can debate the turning point where these lines will cross, but you may end up at the end of the century a situation where direct air capture becomes much cheaper than bioenergy with CCS, and vice versa. And as a consequence, you'll have very different interactions with the energy system. Building on this a little bit further, there's a few, and I guess this is sort of digging into a few more details, there's a few advantages and disadvantages of bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture. This is a bit schematic, and you might want to weight some of these advantages and disadvantages in a bit more nuanced way, but currently costs of bioenergy with CCS might be lower than direct air capture. However, that may change over time. Technological learning, we expect it will be much better or much faster in direct air capture. Bioenergy, it's much more mature technology. Combusting, things in equivalent to a coal power plant, and CCS will probably have lower cost declines, if any. Scalability, particularly because of transport issues. The direct air capture might be more scalable. You can get into some discussions on how big these pluses and minuses should be on some of these issues. Reliability, one issue with BECCS is the accounting and being sure you get what you paid for, whether the bioenergy input is carbon neutral, what losses there are in the supply chain, and so on and so forth. With direct air capture, it's much easier to monitor and verify what's actually captured. So on the reliability side, we'll give a bigger tick, in a sense, to direct air capture. And on the energy input, it's probably more likely that the cost decreases in the electricity sector will be better than the potential cost increases because of biomass. So in the future, the energy inputs are probably likely to be better off for the direct air capture situation. So straight away, when you look at that, you'll see more green crosses or ticks or whatever for the direct air capture, and may think it's the better choice. I think it needs to be a little bit more nuanced than that. Maybe costs will win at the end of the day. But there's many factors which play into these things. So this is a part of the idea of the paper, is trading off some of these advantages and disadvantages. This is just taking one example. I think the data is based on a direct air capture facility in Morocco. Christian Breyer, who is a co-author, will be presenting that in a parallel session, which is why I'm presenting here. So you unfortunately will not be able to learn more about it. But there's a lot going on in this figure, but along the horizontal axis there is the number of hours per year that the direct air capture facility is running, and costs of different types, I'll explain in a minute, on the vertical axis. So the sort of orangey colours are the cost of the direct air capture, which is going down over time, but that cost also goes down over time if you're running that facility more often. So the more you run the facility, the better. And the cost of electricity, I'm not sure of the mechanism here, it's going down over time, but it's also as you operate the plant more, the electricity price is going up. I guess this is a supply-demand related issue. We'd have to ask Christian for the details. But we may get to a situation towards the end of the century where these factors combine, the cost declines of direct air capture sufficient, and the electricity costs play out in a way that if you're running the system on renewables in the future and running the plant at high capacity factor, then direct air capture may become, relatively speaking, quite competitive compared to other forms of carbon dioxide removal. So I've sort of laid out a few different things here. Some of the points that I've made you would be able to debate, and certainly the emphasis, and certainly within our author team we're discussing some of these issues and how important they are and how they may play out. And this essentially means there's a range of emerging research questions. And there hasn't been that much research. There has been a little bit, but not much research looking at how these different technologies integrate into the energy system. So what are the optimal configurations in the future energy system? Direct air capture pathways versus bioenergy pathways that also might lead into different outcomes in terms of the needs of low carbon electricity sources. Direct air capture might need a faster deployment of low carbon electricity sources. Bioenergy with CCS may not need such low deployment of low carbon sources, and so on. So there's those interactions. How will the cost of the electricity system change over time as we move into the future? Carbonising as well as increasing demand due to, for example, direct air capture. Can the systems be, direct air capture and bioenergy with CCS, can they be pretty much pulled out of the energy system? So I gave a hypothetical example. Australia, where I'm from, big open country, no one living in it, particularly in the middle, lots of uranium. Why couldn't you hypothetically build a nuclear power plant feeding only the direct air capture facility with the CO2 stored in the pores out of the way of everybody? Or maybe it's better off to have these facilities linked into the existing energy system around population centres and so on. You know, various questions I think there that are interesting and could be answered. Bioenergy with CCS, you could also, maybe there is not much value in producing electricity from bioenergy with CCS because electricity is cheaper in by other sources. So essentially the electricity from the bioenergy with CCS is a waste product. So then you're just looking at how do I convert bioenergy into some form of storable carbon. Maybe that would make the costs much lower. I think interesting questions to explore there. How will innovation change for these different technologies? Maybe the innovation, the cost declines in direct air capture will be quite substantial. And essentially, you know, many integrated assessment model calculations are very coarse, modelling regions, broad regions, not really modelling the energy system, different types of models, much more fine-grained analysis, allow you to get a much better understanding of how these technologies may integrate into the energy system. So just wrapping up there, so bioenergy and direct air capture are going to closely interact with the energy system. One's going to draw on the energy system, one's going to contribute to it. Nets could dominate the future energy system over other technologies. BECCS, you know, straight off, you might think it's got advantages over direct air capture for a whole variety of reasons, but direct air capture may have much more potential, much more scope for learning, and when we have, let's say, a close to 100% renewable energy future, maybe costs are much lower and maybe direct air capture, the costs of the technology become less relevant over time. And that is it. Thank you.